In this video, I'll explain how all types of verbs work in the present subjunctive in Spanish, which is a continuation from the previous video where I talked about the principles of the subjunctive and understanding how it functions. In these upcoming videos, I'll be covering each tense of the subjunctive starting from the present all the way to the past perfect while showing useful sentences and explaining the concept of each tense. The present subjunctive is the first tense that is learned conceptually, but it's actually one of the hardest concepts of the subjunctive, mainly because it has a lot of irregular verbs, including irregular YO verbs, verbs ending in car, gar, and sar, stem changing, and irregular verbs in general. Like I said in the previous video, you will have to memorize every conjugation of every verb because the second part of the phrase, subject verb que, subject verb, can have any pronoun and any verb. However, in order to activate the subjunctive, the first verb in the sentence would have to be a verb coming from weird, which I showed in the previous video. Before showing sentences in the present subjunctive, we need to understand how every type of verb functions in the present subjunctive. In the second part of the sentence, beginning with regular, AR, ER, and IR verbs all the way to irregular verbs in general. Regular AR, ER, and IR verbs in the present subjunctive are conjugated similarly to -2 commands by changing the ending to the opposite type of the verb itself. For regular AR verbs, you keep the same ending as you would in the present simple, but instead of having an A in every conjugation, you need to change it to E. Taking the verb hablar as an example, instead of keeping its form in the present simple, we have to change only one vowel so that it matches the present subjunctive. Yo hable means I speak in the present subjunctive, tu hables means you speak, él hable means he speaks, and so on. That's how regular AR verbs work in the present subjunctive. For regular ER and IR verbs, you keep the same ending as you would in the present simple, but instead of having an E or E, we need to change the vowel to A. Taking the verbs comer and vivir in the present subjunctive, we have to change only one vowel. Yo coma or yo viva means I eat or I live, tu comas or tu vivas means you eat or you live, and so on. That's how regular ER and IR verbs work in the present subjunctive. And if you take a closer look, you can probably tell that only one letter changes in these verbs, so it's basically a switch between the types of verbs. That's how regular verbs function in the present subjunctive, specifically in the second part of the phrase, subject verb que, subject verb, or a main clause plus subject verb. Now that I showed how regular verbs work in the present subjunctive, you'll have to memorize this pattern because you will have to use it all the time whenever you want to say a sentence in the present subjunctive using any pronoun and any regular AR, ER, or IR verb. That's the first concept of the present subjunctive. The second concept of the present subjunctive is irregular YO verbs, which are similar to nosotros commands. Obviously, I will not put every irregular YO verb on the list because you don't need all of them. Instead, I'll give the most useful verbs, which include conducir, decir, hacer, oír, tener, traer, venir, and ver. Of course, there's other verbs that will follow these irregular patterns, but you don't need to know them. What makes irregular YO verbs more difficult than regular verbs is the way they're conjugated for every pronoun and the way that you have to memorize their pattern. Typically, irregular YO verbs are only irregular in the YO pronoun in the present simple. Taking the verb conducir in the present simple, every word is conjugated normally except in the YO pronoun. Yo conduzco. In the present subjunctive, however, you will have to take the ending of the conjugation of the YO pronoun and repeat it across every pronoun. Additionally, because conducir is an IR verb, we have to put the opposite ending from E and E to A so that it corresponds to every pronoun. In the present subjunctive, conducir will look like this. Yo conduzca, tú conduzcas, él conduzca, and so on. As you can see, we took the irregular conjugation of the yo pronoun from the present simple and put it at the end of every conjugation in the present subjunctive. Additionally, we also changed the vowel in the end from e and e to a in order to maintain the proper conjugation of every pronoun. That's the system of conjugating irregular yo verbs in the present subjunctive. And as I said in the previous video, you will have to memorize every conjugation of every pronoun because any pronoun aside from vosotros can be used in the present subjunctive. Now that you hopefully understand this concept, let's finish the rest of the irregular YO verbs in the present subjunctive together. Let's take the verb decir. From what I've shown, how would you conjugate the verb decir in the present subjunctive? In case you're having trouble, remember to take the conjugation of the yo pronoun from the present simple, apply the ending to every pronoun, and change the vowel at the end to match the pronoun. In the present subjunctive, decir will look like this. Yo diga, tú digas, él diga, and so on. Like I said previously, you will have to memorize every conjugation of every pronoun. After decir, we have the verb hacer. How would you conjugate this verb in the present subjunctive? Yo haga, tú hagas, él haga, and so on. Now, how would you conjugate oír? Yo oiga, tú oigas, él oiga, and so on. How do you conjugate the verb tener? Yo tenga, tú tengas, él tenga, and so on. How do you conjugate the verb traer? Yo traiga, tú traigas, él traiga, and so on. How do you conjugate venir? Yo venga, tú vengas, él venga, and so on. And finally, how do you conjugate ver? Yo vea, tú veas, él vea, and so on. This is the entire concept of how irregular yo verbs function in the present subjunctive. And like I say all the time, you need to memorize all of these conjugations because any pronoun can be used in the present subjunctive. Of course, there's other irregular yo verbs in the present subjunctive, but we don't need to cover all of them. That's the second concept of the present subjunctive. The third concept of the present subjunctive is verbs that end in car, gar, and sar. And these verbs have a spelling change in every conjugation. An easy way to memorize them is by using the irregular conjugation of the yo pronoun from the past simple. To make your learning much simpler, I'm going to use one verb from each category to show how the system functions. Let's take the verb marcar. In order to put this verb in the present subjunctive, we have to take its irregular form in the yo pronoun from the past simple and replicate it across every pronoun, and then change the vowel at the end so that it matches the pronoun. Marcar in the present subjunctive will be yo marque, tú marques, él marque, and so on. That's the spelling change that this verb has, along with the vowel change in the end. Now, let's take the verb pagar. How would you conjugate this verb in the present subjunctive? Yo pague, tú pagues, él pague, and so on. That's the spelling change that this verb has. At last, let's take the verb organizar. How would you conjugate it in the present subjunctive? Yo organice, tú organices, él organice, and so on. That's the third concept of the present subjunctive. The fourth concept of the present subjunctive is stem changing verbs, which I think is the easiest, mainly because they have the same changes as they do in the present simple, except when changing the vowel in the end. Taking verbs like pensar and volver, the only difference between these verbs in the present simple and the present subjunctive is the ending. Stem changing verbs function the same way as in the present simple, except with the vowel change at the end. Yo pienso becomes yo piense, yo vuelvo becomes yo vuelva, and the same idea applies to the rest of the conjugations and to any other stem-changing verb. However, there are a few exceptions involving verbs ending in IR that change their stem in the nosotros and vosotros pronouns. These verbs can go from E to I like pedir, from E to IE like sentir, and from O to UE like dormir. There could be other verbs in the present subjunctive that follow these patterns, but you don't need to know all of them. That's how stem-changing verbs work in the present subjunctive. And now we get to irregular verbs in general, which have little to no pattern to follow at all, so you will have to remember them as they are. In this category, there are only 5 verbs: estar, dar, ser, saber, and ir. In the present subjunctive, the verb estar will look like this: yo esté, tú estés, él esté, and so on. What makes estar irregular in the present subjunctive is the presence of accents, except nosotros. Nonetheless, it's a simple verb to memorize. After estar, we have the verb dar, which looks like this: yo de, tú des, él de, and so on. After dar, we have the verb ser, which copies the same pattern as the verb ver: yo sea, tú seas, él sea, and so on. After ser, we have the verb saber, which has a pattern similar to its form in the past simple: yo sepa, tú sepas, él sepa, and so on. And finally, we have the verb ir, which by far is the most irregular verb in the present subjunctive: yo vaya, tú vayas, él vaya, and so on. Even though you can technically find a pattern in some of these verbs, I recommend just memorizing them in one motion. And right now, I covered the fifth and final concept of the present subjunctive. In this video, and the video before this one, I explained how the subjunctive works in Spanish by talking about its tenses, verbs, and conjugations that you all have to know, understand, and memorize. Even though I did not present any sentences in this video, I did give a sufficient amount of information in order to understand how the present subjunctive works and how all types of verbs function in it. In the next video, I'll only show phrases and sentences in order to fully finish the concept of the present subjunctive. For your information, there will not be any sentences involving negatives and reflexive verbs, mainly because they're not that useful in the present subjunctive, and also because there is no irregular concept with them. So that's it.